Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Don Parkinson, and I'm a senior consultation specialist with Atkins Realis. Today, we are continuing our series of live stream topics on the Northern Road Link project as it moves through the provincial environmental assessment and federal impact assessment processes. The topics we are covering parallel our project activities, so we hope these will help our viewers and listeners better understand the project and provide input along the way. Uh, Unfortunately, this week I don't have my usual co-host, Jennifer. She'll be back, I think, in 2 weeks. And with that, why don't we get started? Great topic today. We're going to talk about the Indigenous Knowledge Program that we're undertaking as part of the environmental and impact assessments. So, as we usually do, we're going to do a bit of a overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to provide the usual project background just to get everyone up to the same level in terms of knowledge of the project. We're going to talk about what is Indigenous knowledge. We're going to talk about the Indigenous Knowledge Program. We're going to talk about Indigenous knowledge information collection, sharing, and protection. And then finally, we'll talk about how information will be used in the impact assessment process. So this will serve to be a bit of an overview of the program. There's more details available, of course, that we can provide. But I think this will give people a pretty good sort of briefing as to what it involves. So with that, why don't we get started and provide a little bit of background on the project. The Northern Road Link project is a proposed all-season road in Northern Ontario, sitting on Treaty 9 land. It would connect the Ring of Fire mineral deposits to the all-season provincial highway network via the proposed Martin Falls Community Access Road. And at the same time, it would provide an opportunity for Webequie First Nation to the north to connect to the all-season highway network. And I will get into an explanation of that in a few minutes, showing how all these three different all-season roads will ultimately connect together to the provincial highway network. The Northern Road Link project is subject to the Environmental Assessment Act and the Impact Assessment Act. Proponents are both remote Indigenous communities, Martin Falls First Nation and Webequie First Nation. Both of these communities are about 500 kilometers north of Thunder Bay in slightly different directions. And of course, being remote, are not currently accessible by all season roads. They are accessed by winter roads that are typically only available they're available less and less now due to climate change, but typically around 4 to 6 weeks of the year. There have been a number of historical studies done on this transportation corridor, looking at rail, looking at roads as well. In 2020, Ontario, the province of Ontario, together with Martin Falls First Nation and Webequie First Nation, decided to work together, and both communities agreed to conduct a provincial environmental assessment, which then became a federal impact assessment slightly later on as well. So that is where we stand now. And I was talking earlier about the interaction of the three projects. So these projects were all conceived at different times for different purposes. The Webequie Supply Road is the northernmost planned all-season road connecting Webequie Airport, and then traveling to the Ring of Fire by traveling southeast from Webequie Airport, and then turning east to the McFalls Lake area, just east of the Mukatai River, which is essentially in the sort of the center of the Ring of Fire. It would then connect with the northern end of the Northern Road Link, planned Northern Road Link all-season road, which then would run south, connecting with the Martin Falls Community Access Road west of Martin Falls. And then the Martin Falls Community Access Road would connect with a series of upgraded resource roads, which would then connect ultimately to the provincial highway. So that's how everything all fits together. And the Northern Road Link project in general would enable economic activity by helping with the transport of goods, services, and resources, connecting Martin Falls to the provincial highway network, and then, of course, with the Webequie Supply Road being built, that would connect Webequie First Nation as well. In terms of the project components, I always say it's more than just a two-lane road. This would be an all-season, multi-use road. Right now, we don't have a definite length for the road. It would range between 117 and 164 kilometers, depending on which alternative segments are selected, and these are in the process of being finalized. And once these are all connected together, then we will have a final definite length for the road. The right-of-way for the road would be 100 meters. There would be numerous water crossings, as you can imagine, that would be served by culverts and bridges, but the largest crossing being that of the Attawapiskat River, which would be a crossing of over 200 meters, and so that is the biggest crossing. There are other crossings that are significantly smaller than that as well. So there may be a couple of other bridges, but mainly the culverts will be used as water crossing structures. And then we move to the ancillary infrastructure, and what we mean by ancillary is additional infrastructure required to support the road. So some of these would be temporary during construction, such as storage and laydown areas for the storage and laydown of equipment and materials, maintenance facilities, which would be permanent, maintenance yards, maintenance facilities. There would be access roads that would need to be built to access, for example, the pits and quarries where the material for building the road and also material for maintaining the road in the case, and those facilities would be permanent. And then finally, there would be construction camps built. Typically, the storage and laydown areas are associated with the construction camps, and these would be built at regular intervals along the road to help with efficient construction. I mentioned earlier about alternative corridors, and this is the reason why we don't have a definite length for the road at this point. There's different alternative road segments for different areas. However, this is being finalized as we speak. So soon we will have a definite length for the road and a definite corridor, preferred corridor for the road as well. So what we're talking about here when we say corridor, this isn't just where the roads would specifically be. This is a corridor of 2 kilometers in width, within which the road would sit. This 2 kilometer wide corridor gives us room to make adjustments based on new information that we determine, or if we identify, for example, um, environmentally sensitive areas that hadn't been identified before, or areas that are culturally sensitive that we didn't know about before. This 2 kilometer wide corridor gives us room to adjust the position of the road in terms of what Indigenous knowledge is. Indigenous knowledge is it's not just one particular thing. There's no single definition to it. It takes a lot of different forms. But generally speaking, it represents what you call the worldview of Indigenous people, and it's holistic. meaning that it's not based on just one type of information. It's a larger picture, has many parts to it that are all interconnected. It's complex. It could be, stories. It could be information on recorded on maps about locations. It takes so many different forms. Um, One of the definitions that I've read is that I find pretty accurate is it is a body or collection of knowledge built up by a group of Indigenous people over generations of living closely connected to the land. So I think that's a pretty good, pretty accurate description of what Indigenous knowledge is. Um, and the one important thing I think to remember is that it's always changing. It's cumulative. So meaning it builds on top of itself. It grows with time and it changes uh, with um, with changes in the economy, with changes in politics, with changes in uh, legislation, changes in the environment, spiritual changes, maybe a shift more towards traditional spirituality might make changes to our Indigenous knowledge base. Um, social changes can impact it as well too. So it's a very difficult thing to really sort of nail down. But the most important thing to remember, it's a collection of knowledge that's always changing over time, growing and expanding. You may be familiar with another version of another term that has been used previously. It was called traditional knowledge. Um, Sometimes they're used interchangeably. They have been at least in the past. Knowledge is more commonly used now because it recognizes that it's constantly changing and it's not just based on traditions from the past. So it's something that's dynamic. It's a living thing. So different forms of Indigenous knowledge. I think many people are probably familiar with the geospatial form, and when I talk about that, what I'm talking about is information on maps, information that's geographically referenced, that has a specific location associated with it. So traditionally, these have been things like burial sites, cultural landscapes or land features, harvesting locations, spiritual sites, like sacred sites, ceremonial areas, areas of archaeological potential, um, travel routes that have been used historically, access routes, travel routes, portage routes, um, locations of hunting, trapping, fishing camps. Currently or in the past, or cabins, or teaching grounds, or gathering areas, um, times of access to traditional locations, different types of years, things like that. And then, but it also takes other forms, as I was talking about a bit earlier. It takes input from community surveys. So you can build on Indigenous knowledge in a lot of different ways through these surveys, through focus groups, where you're sitting down with community members and learning about traditions and the clan system, how communities govern themselves, how they make decisions, lots of different sources, listening to stories or oral histories from community members. There's many different sources of information, which explains why Indigenous knowledge takes many different forms. So in terms of what the Indigenous Knowledge Program is, the IK program aims to collect knowledge, IK knowledge, relevant to the Northern Road Link project. And so this could include land and resource use information, also known as ILRU, Indigenous Land and Resource Use, and important cultural values in and around the project area, as well as studies that are undertaken as part of the environmental assessment or impact assessment process. And where the skill really comes in is taking this Indigenous knowledge information that's generated from the Indigenous Knowledge Program and blending it in and combining it with Western scientific knowledge and approaches, and doing this not just in isolation, but in all aspects of the environmental assessment or impact assessment, including baseline conditions, potential impact, and possible mitigation measures and follow-up programs. And traditionally, in the past, in environmental assessments, there would be a separate section on Indigenous knowledge, so it would sort of stand alone on its own. But now the expectation and the correct expectation, of course, is that it be fully integrated with all disciplines and all studies that are conducted as part of an environmental assessment or an impact assessment. So it's now becoming fully integrated into the environmental assessment. In terms of the objectives of the Indigenous Knowledge Program, some of these are obvious, but identifying areas where Indigenous land uses such as hunting, trapping, fishing, or gathering, and important resources so resources being water, being moose, or important values such as culture, sharing information about your culture could be impacted by the proposed project. So does the proposed project impact on any of those components? That's the question that's asked. Um, Another objective is to understand community views about um, positive or negative effects of the project on resource use and important values. Another objective is to sit down and work with communities to figure out ways of avoiding or mitigating, reducing, sometimes eliminating potential negative impacts of the project. And then finally, another final objective is to work with communities to maximize the potential positive impacts as well too. So accentuating the positive. How can we, through this project, maximize and allow it to have the most positive impact on the community? Another key consideration when conducting an Indigenous knowledge program is information collection, sharing, and protection. So the IK program has two phases for information gathering and sharing. The first is to identify and review pre-existing relevant sources of Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous land and resource use um, that's been collected by communities previously. So through, for example, community-based land use planning exercises. So that was one phase, and then completing project-specific Indigenous knowledge or Indigenous land and resource use studies to collect Indigenous knowledge and information within the project area. But a key part of this, and one I can't underestimate or emphasize more, is how this information will be protected. So our team, the NRL project team, will work with communities to develop sharing agreements, Indigenous knowledge sharing agreements, before this information is shared. And we will, in these agreements, it will detail how this information could be shared, in what form, just the details about that. And so the agreement will outline how confidential, sensitive information will become part of the EA and IA and protected because it remains under the ownership of the First Nations. And so they have control as to how it can be used in the environmental assessment. So, for example, specific locations for certain things, specific locations, whether it's spawning areas or areas where community members typically go fishing for a specific species. They may not, community members or the community itself may not want this information shared, so they will just provide a general location, not a specific location. So that's a really important component of this, and like I said, we can't emphasize it enough. And this next slide I'm bringing up on the screen is one I think is helpful, I think. I think it gives people an idea of how everything sort of ties together. So you've got the existing knowledge base, existing IK and your desktop studies, and then you combine that with the project studies. So whether they're project IK studies, our field programs to for baseline data collection, and then blending these two things together to develop baseline conditions. So painting that sort of holistic, sort of all-encompassing picture of the way things are now, not just on the science side in terms of water quality and the chemistry of the water is this and the fish community is this, but combining that with the indigenous knowledge side of things and putting all that together. There's no recipe to doing this necessarily, um, but it can be done well. And this is a rapidly evolving skill, I think, combining indigenous knowledge uh, with Western science, as they call it, to develop baseline conditions. But it's moving in the right direction. Let's put it that way. And finally, now we're going to talk a little bit about how IK or Indigenous knowledge information will be used in the impact assessment process. So uh, we're going to use it to do a lot of different things. First, to guide and confirm the indicator. So remember what an indicator is? The indicators are measures of impacts on valued components, the things that are being studied as part of the environmental assessment or impact assessment. So IK IK information helps guide and confirm these indicators, these measuring tools. Um, Also, the IK information will be used to describe existing environmental conditions for the valued components, the things being studied, the things that have been identified as important by community members and technical experts and the general public that are worthy of study. IK will also be used to assess alternatives and select the preferred methods of carrying out the project. IK information will identify the possible effects of the project on ATRI, Aboriginal and treaty rights and interests. They will also help identify the potential effects of the project on the various valued components, things that are being studied, such as water quality, water quantity, or fisheries, fish, fish habitat. Also, identifying measures to reduce the possibility of negative impacts and enhancing the benefits. So, IK, as you can tell, is fitting into a lot of different areas and has a major role in this process. And then assessing cumulative effects. When we talk about cumulative effects, we're talking about effects not just looking at our project, the Northern Road Link project, but all the other projects from the past that are currently um, in that are existing projects and reasonably foreseeable future projects. So IK information helps assess those cumulative effects from all of those projects together. And then finally, they help identify possible follow-up and monitoring programs that, as we know, typically if an environmental assessment or an impact assessment receives an approval, there are conditions associated with it and commitments associated with it. And IK knowledge or IK information can help with developing these follow up and monitoring programs as well too. So as I mentioned, IK information plays a huge role in so many different aspects of the environmental assessment and impact assessment. So with that, that was a lot to cover in a short period of time, but we have covered it, and we will definitely be getting into talking about Indigenous knowledge in even more detail in the near future. But for today, that wraps up today's discussion of the IK program. We hope this was helpful and encourages you to join us again next week when we discuss the Species at Risk study plan. Don't forget to keep in touch with our project team members via the contact information available on our website, northernroadlink.ca. Miigwech, and make sure to look out for our project updates on social media and our website. See you soon.